This is how we usher you into our big stories for the day. We're talking about public sector workers, whether they are overpaid or not. Well, joining us on the phone lines, we have Professor Samuel Kobina Enim, government statistician. He joins us for a conversation. Prof, a very good morning to you, sir. Thank you so much for your time. I am struggling, Prof, to hear you. I don't know whether you could speak up a little for me, please.
Well.
All right, so it's really tricky hearing Prof.
Hello,
right
can you hear
now.
me?
Right, the volume, it's better now. Thank you so much. So we've seen in recent times what you've said at that inaugural lecture about public sector workers being overpaid. There's been a lot of talk about it. It appears some people don't really understand what you're trying to say. So the question is, what do you mean when you say public sector workers are overpaid? Very simple question, but it's important we get the ground rules right. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you once again. The bottom line is that I never said public sector workers are being overpaid.
You never said that?
No. I didn't say public sector workers are being overpaid. I introduced the conversation on productivity, and indeed, I did it in the context of four other variables. So essentially what I sought to do is to start a conversation that says that the formal sector, which is mainly public sector, contributes 3/4 to our GDP. 3/4 to our GDP. Our huge informal sector contributes only 25% to our GDP. The next thing that I sought to do was to demonstrate the inequalities in earnings that we have. And unfortunately, as a country, we've been reporting consumption expenditure inequality. So what my lecture sought to do is that first picture that clearly demonstrates the contribution of the formal sector to our GDP, which, as I said, is mainly public sector driven, and then say that if you look at inequalities from an earnings point of view, based on data from the public sector, we have very stark inequalities. And I demonstrated that with what in economics we call the Gini coefficient. So once the Gini coefficient is closer to 1, it characterizes a perfect, a near perfect unequal state. Then using the data on earnings, I showed that the Gini coefficient was 0.71 if you take away the outliers. Then the third variable that I talked about has to do with productivity. And I said, if we always have been releasing GDP and we don't measure productivity, how can we track the progress that we want to make on GDP? Then I said, look at our population that are employed from the census, look at our GDP, and then this is the output per person, and this is the earnings per person in the public sector space. This is a conversation that we should have because in economics we say that what you earn should be equal to your output, and that should be equal to what you spend. But we are seeing this disparity. And I only use the public sector as a proxy for earnings. And indeed said, even if you throw in the earnings within the private sector, which we all know that is higher than the public sector, we're going to see a wider variation between our output per head as a country and our earnings per head as a country. So I never said they are overpaid. I never even went to say that this is a threshold for measuring productivity, so once they are below it, they are not productive.
So that point has to be made forcefully. So in other words, maybe a lot of the rhetoric surrounding what you said was misconstrued by most Ghanaians. But you're a professor of economics. When you speak about what you earn being commensurable with your output, it basically means that what you're putting into your work makes you deserving of what salary you get. But then, though you're saying you never hinted at the fact that public sector workers were being overpaid, when you suggest, per the statistics, the data you gathered, that earnings on average are about 3,420 for the public sector worker, but that their output is around 1,420 cedis, less than half the earnings. Is it not the same thing as saying that public sector workers are not giving off enough for what they are paid. In other words, they are being overpaid.
Can I correct that? The output of 1,420 is not for public sector only.
All right.
That's why I'm saying we need to be interrogating the numbers.
Right.
I simply picked our GDP in real terms for 2021, which was about 175 billion, looked at our number of people who are employed, which is about 9.9 million, and then narrowed this down to a monthly output. So this is for the entire country. So the essence of my presentation was to say that can we, and I concluded by saying we should have a public productivity committee which will begin to have this conversation so that if as a country we need to start measuring output on a sector basis, not agri industry and services, but public sector, private sector basis, then we do that. And that is why I was so careful. I didn't want to bring in anything like this 3420 from the public sector. It's 2,000 or twice the 1420.
And so, in essence, it is clear that so the 1,420 that you put out there, that figure is reflective of the entire working population. Does that also factor in private sector workers?
Yes, as I said, it's data based on the census and our GDP. So it's the value of our economy from the GDP point of view, which includes both public and private.
Let me also make this important point, since we have you. Workers have been demanding pay, raises above inflation and all of that. I'm bringing this up because you are the same person who also gives us our inflationary rates. Now, I'm looking at today's inflation rate as of the last inflation rate we got, 23.6%. We're looking at the policy rate of government, which stands at 19%, which also means that when the central bank lends to these other banks, this is what they're going to get. Generally, then you would see that the banks would also lend to us at a higher rate, between anything from 20 to 25 or plus percent. We're looking at T-bills hitting at an 8-year high, though they're at 22.57%. Inflation is covering for all of this. So the question I want to pose to you, Prof, is this. In the midst of all of this, the economic constraints on the public sector worker especially, would you say that our public sector workers are being paid what they merit, or they are being paid above what they merit by and large, or maybe they are being paid less than they merit when you put together inflation, which you have generated for us, side by side with these other economic dynamics?
Thank you very much. I would always hesitate in giving a yes or no response to a question like that. And this is exactly what I sought to do in my lecture. And I'm happy you've touched on X number of variables that one should look at if you are thinking about whether somebody merits a pay or not. So you are looking at it from the cost of living point of view, which is fine. I mean, once cost of living is going up and you need to do some adjustment, Ghana will not be the only country looking at its wages, earnings for public sector amid all the global economic challenges that we have. But the other side of the coin is that can we begin to have the conversation on our productivity and relate that to our output? Anytime we have these conversations only from the financial side, the money side of the economy, without talking about the real sector of the economy, we tend to have challenges. So all that I'm saying is that let's now begin to map our GDP sector-wise, so that once somebody is going in for a bargain for higher salaries, we don't just look at the cost of living side, but look at the productivity side as well.
Right.
So please, can we begin to put some numbers to it? Because at the lecture, I did a very crude calculation and said, if you narrow earnings on hourly basis, it's 7 cities 95 pesos, 7 Ghana cities 95 pesos. And the question that I pose is, if, for instance, you invite an artisan to work for you, and the artisan says that I'm charging 100 Ghana cedis for a day, is that consistent with the average hourly earnings that we have as a country? Well, what is the basis for which we do what we do in terms of payment?
Prof, do hold for me just for a bit. This is a crucial conversation we're having, and it's interesting the new dynamic you toss into the picture that, in fact, you never hinted that public sector workers are overpaid. But just hold for me. Let me bring in Professor William Boateng, who is head Department of Economics at the University of Ghana. Prof, a very good morning to you. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So your opposite number from the UCC, Professor Enim, gave us the data. He talks about putting productivity side by side with earnings. Basically, your output must be equivalent to, or maybe even above, what you're earning. And then we talk about the facts and the figures that he puts out there. He cites that generally, and I'm just looking for the figure. So the public sector, in fact, workers averaging 3,420 cedis per month, while their output is about 1,420 cedis, which is less than half of the earnings. And this is not just for the public sector. The discussion had been that public sector workers were being overpaid. But how do you react to what the government statistician says on face value?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning to your viewers and listeners. Let me say that I was at a lecture, and even before the lecture, the government statistician is a very good friend of mine. The concern that he has, having become the government statistician, regard to data and issues related to policy making and so on, is a conversation that we've had for a long time, before he even became government statistician. And many issues that he raised have been raised even in policy quarters. And I will talk about even productivity. I worked closely with Ghana Tripartite Committee, and here I'm talking about Ministry of Employment, Organized Labor, and Employers. And since 2007, the determination of minimum wage, Organized Labor has consistently spoken about the fact that minimum wage should incorporate productivity. And indeed, when the minimum wage is determined, the formula that they have to use a crude method of productivity to be able to pick out the contribution of workers in determining the minimum wage. So he was not saying anything different. He was just drawing our attention to the fact that as a country, we cannot continue to say that we want to grow, we want to develop, when we don't even know how to measure productivity. We don't even know, if I go to the classroom, I will be able to know what contribution I have made to the kitty. And for that matter, if I'm being paid, government will not have a problem in paying me. In basic economics, what we say is that the marginal productivity of the individual should be equal to the wage in a competitive environment. And that is what it's supposed to be. However, as a country, it is very, very difficult to determine the productivity of a particular sector. Let's say agricultural sector, let's say industry, even in industry, manufacturing, in the service sector. It's even difficult to even measure my productivity as a teacher, to be able to know that what contribution I'm making to the kitty is what government is paying me. So I sat quietly. He spoke for more than 1.5 hours. I did not get any kind of statement saying that public sector workers are overpaid. And indeed, we also have to put it in perspective. The data he used the GDP overall and looked at everything regarding what we have in Ghana, and then looked at earnings that we have in the public sector. And when we talk about public sector is huge. Public sector includes the executive, the judiciary, the legislature, myself as a teacher, the doctor in the hospital, the civil servant, and everybody. And we know that when we come to public sector and you are looking at our earnings, there is a very big inequality in our system. Because if you look at those of us on a single spine, our salaries are so low compared to other group of public sector workers. So I would have been surprised if he had made a statement of that nature. And I never got any statement. And he couldn't have made that statement because you cannot even get GDP for public sector workers to be able to compare the earning. And he was very, very careful in those analyses. And I'm also surprised that in all these discussions, what is confronting the country currently: unemployment. And unemployment definition is something that has been on the table for a long time. And he spent time to also explain how we define unemployment, how we define employment. And for that matter, if you say somebody is unemployed, what are we talking about? If you say unemployment is 13.4%, what are we talking about? And therefore, how will policymakers sit down and say, we want to address unemployment? And I always say that the way we look at some of these things, policymakers will be chasing the wind. So he was drawing our attention, and having a productivity, a group, or let's say a body which is going to look at productivity, is consistent with what a National Tripartite Committee has preached all this while.
All right. A crucial point you made, and it's interesting, in a country where, the wage bill of government can hit about 11 to 12% of GDP, in a country where, practically we're spending about 10% of our GDP on the public sector wages, if not more, because a lot of the time it is one of the aspects that hobbles our economy, so to speak. We're pumping so much into this. I find it disturbing, Prof, when you say that we don't even know how to measure productivity or output, especially when it comes to the public sector. What then should we be doing in that regard? Else we'd be shelling out money and basically not getting what the state requires in terms of work.
And let me quote President Kufuor, who once said that government pretend to be paying workers, and then workers pretend to be working. If I take that statement, I juxtapose it to the fact that almost always government is saying that the wage bill is so high. But workers, and let me say majority of workers, are also complaining that we were underpaid. So there is a missing link. And that even is consistent with Professor Enim's lecture that spoke about issues of data, biases in data. So even the wage bill that government puts up, does that money that government talks about indeed goes to workers? We are in this country where we say there are a lot of ghost names in our payroll. So how will you know that even the 100 cities which government say it is the wage bill, just about 70% may be going to people who are truly working? And it is consistent with what Professor Enim was saying, that data is something that we have to take a very good care of, that we have to pay very good attention to it, because workers are always complaining that they are underpaid, which is true. However, government is also saying that we are our neck is breaking when it comes to our finances. And we also don't have to put all public sector workers together. There are differences. You and I know that we have about 4 different groups when it comes to determination of wages. And I may give 3. The first one are the group who are on the single spine. And I'm happy that the single spine policy is being reviewed. That's the first group. The second group is what we call the Article 71 office holders. And how much they are paid, you cannot compare it with those with the single spine. The third are those public sector institutions that are allowed to pay from their own budget. So you talk about NCA, you talk about Cocoa Board, you talk about other institutions that are paid, like the Tourist Authority and all those authorities. Now, when you look at this, there's a fourth one. When you look at this, you see that there's earnings inequality and inequity in the system. And if all these box together and it is found on the wage bill, you will by all means find those at the lower echelon of the ladder complaining that they are not well paid. And many of these people are on the single spine, including myself in the teaching service, including medical doctors, including civil servants, including almost all public service workers, the police, and so on. But when you compare our average earnings to those on the singles, to those on Article 71 office holders, you see a huge disparity. And when you compare it with those who are supposed to pay from their own budget, it is also huge. And analysis that I did, I don't have it here, if I recollect very well, the average earnings of those on the single spine, if it is 1, Those on Article 71 office holders is about 6 times. And here I am talking about average. And that is a huge inequality. So these are the realities on the ground. And Professor Enim tried to say that, well, we need to interrogate this. And indeed, if we cannot measure our own productivity, it becomes very, very difficult to know our contribution. I know in the past, the former Minister of Public Sector Ministry, I think I think I've forgotten the name. He used to be a presidential candidate for PPP, said that it is time for public sector workers to clock in, so that when you go to work, we know that this is your contribution. You don't go out and just moving around. We know that you are there and working. And I can tell you, in some institutions in Ghana,
right.
I know Bank of Ghana in particular, you clock in and then you clock out. In Bank of Ghana, you cannot just go and just be loitering around. At least that is what I know.
But another dimension to the conversation, Prof, is also this, and I'll be moving on to Dr. Patrick Esuming, but another dimension to the conversation is clocking in and clocking out is not necessarily the solution. It may be part of the solution, but you can clock in and not be effective or efficient, even while being at post. And we know about other systems where people can clock in and then sort of disappear. We see all of these in the public sector as well. So I mean, I'm just putting that to you. It's not an all-embracing solution, is it?
Yes, but it is not just one solution to it. Clocking in is one, supervision, and in trying to improve productivity, one important measure is supervision. So if your supervisor is making sure that they are giving you a target and you are meeting the target and you are going to be paid based on what you have achieved, that is one way of also propping up productivity.
All right. Let me come now to Dr. Patrick Esuming, economist with the University of Ghana Business School. He also joins the conversation. So this entire lecture, this inaugural lecture, as delivered by Professor Enim, also it sort of, stirred the hornet's nest, because we've heard from teacher groupings, we've heard from many people from different aspects of society, public work, who are saying, wait a minute. And that has been clarified by Professor Enim, that he never intimated categorically that public sector workers are overpaid. But on the back of what Professor Bob Watting has been sharing about, output and clocking systems and all of that, Doc, do you feel that it is high time, looking at the component of our GDP that goes into paying public sector wages, that we took a second look at these wages to get proper benefits as a country from the work of public sector workers, especially?
Good morning, and good morning to viewers and also my colleagues.
Right.
So I think, as for the public sector wage bill and the public sector currently clamoring for more wages, if you look at the cost of living, even from January 2021 till now, based on the CPI releases, you notice that the cost of living has gone up about 28%. Over that same period, the public sector pay has gone up just over 11%. So clearly, from that standpoint, you see that from that point, there's been an erosion of real wages, upward of about 15%. So you can understand why the public sector will clamor for wages, for additional wages. But I think what we need to juxtapose with what the government statistician has said, and then also what Prof. Barberton has said, is that if it's fair to grant these wages on the larger scale. If you grant these wages, assuming that the additional wage doesn't come with additional output, additional productivity,
right,
you could actually end up fueling the inflation further, because then you are going to have several people having more money to spend. And if we are not generating additional output on which to spend this money, then we end up with the situation, as people say in inflation, more money chasing fewer goods. So I think every time we discuss public sector wages, we should also discuss it in terms of what this means for productivity. So the conversation always have to go together. If you recall, even with the single spine, it wasn't just about adjustment of the wages. It's supposed to have a productivity element that should be monitored. I think the problem is that sometimes, like it's been pointed out, we don't really have a very good way of assessing people's productivity, and then we don't have the data both at the aggregated and the disaggregated level to see who deserves what.
How do we, especially as we talk about single spine and all of that and the problems that have bedeviled it, how do we rectify that? Because if there's no measurability, if there's no way of saying, look, public sector X is expected to do this. If he's not doing this, he doesn't deserve his wages. Maybe he gets the axe. I guess that's the fundamental problem, part of the problem. How do we deal with that as a country?
Well, let's think about what the private sector does. You know, if a private sector person employs someone, that there are targets. You know, they will define the role and they will say what tasks are required of the role and to what level those tasks should be performed. And then they'll give you clear targets and indicators for you to meet. And the employer does what is required to monitor that you are meeting your targets before you get paid the salary that comes with the task, with the job. I think it's on the employer in this case to put in the measures to ensure that people that are on the public payroll are deserving the task, or they are performing the task on daily, on monthly, on hourly basis, that for which they have been employed. And that if people are not performing the task, the necessary consequences take place. And I think that's why the issue about supervision and the issue about monitoring has come into the discussion. So, you know, obviously the public sector is bigger and it's a little bit more complex to measure than in the private sector. But I think it gives us clear indicators. Every employment, every job has its task, has its requirement, and it should have indicators for measuring whether you've met it or not. And then if you are not meeting the target, then you will, you know, whatever sanction has to apply. So I think the other thing is incentive pay. You know, if you look at the private sector, one of the things they do is, where it is very difficult to measure productivity, they put incentives. So if you are meeting so much task, or if you are meeting the requirement, or, you know, if they can't measure your output, then what they do is that, okay, if you work so hard and then some profit comes in, then there's some profit sharing arrangement. So there's some well-built incentive structure to ensure that even in cases where we cannot directly observe your productivity, we are paying you based on overall contribution that comes. We see it in the financial system. We see it in insurance, for instance. Because if an insurer says, go out there and bring business, they can't observe whether you are actually working hard and convincing clients to bring in more people. But at the end of the day, if you are bringing in clients, then they know that you are working, and therefore they are paying you based on commission. So the more you work, the more you receive. And that's really what the discussion should be about.
Okay.
So what Prof. Annin has brought to bear is that we need to have this discussion.
Right.
And therefore, while we are talking about, you know, productivity, we as a country, we have to think about, you know, innovative ways of ensuring that we are measuring productivity in the public sector. Right. And we are paying people commensurate to what they are contributing. It's
interesting as I bring in Professor Gachi. It's interesting because oftentimes, even in, you know, discussions with friends and others, one thing that comes up is they'll say that the typical Ghanaian worker would be sloppy about his or her work, especially in the public sector. But let him travel to the West, then he becomes the hardest worker, you know, in whichever entity he finds himself. But for you, Professor Gachi, as I take your initial comments, I want you to focus them on this. We're looking at a certain trajectory. It's been mentioned. You look at public sector wages, the tripartite committee sits an increment of maybe 4 to 7%. Article 71 office holders get way more, sometimes maybe as much as 10 times more. You look at the number of industrial actions we've had, Cloxa, Guta, and all of them. It points to something. It points to the fact that while wages are not increasing, you look at our inflation, 23.6%. You look at the lending rate, 19%. all of that paints a picture, doesn't it? Just to add to this, we've heard that 3,000 nurses have left the country, on the back of, and what are they complaining about? Poor wages, long working hours, without the right logistics. What picture does that paint for you? Does the ordinary Ghanaian worker get overpaid or underpaid? What is your take on that?
Okay, thank you. I think the answer to that question will be found in the essence of the lecture. So what the presenter sought to do is to indicate that he agrees that there is inequality, both in terms of income distribution, there is productivity issues, and there is unemployment measurement issues. Then he went ahead to even make a statement to the effect that it is not good for us to have a situation where your basic pay is about 3 times lower than the allowances cumulatively, because that tends to affect you negatively when you go on pension. So these are issues that we need to address. But to be able to address that, we need to collect quality data. The process or data protocol will have to be defined and fall within a certain metrics. And that would transition into the kind of policy or steps we take in addressing these issues. So I think that the purpose of the lecture tends to address the issue that you just raised, why some seem to be paid higher than others. It doesn't matter if Article 71 office holders are being paid higher than all of us. The key issue, in my opinion, from the takeaway from the lecture is that whatever they are being paid should be measured against some productivity. Whatever they are paid should be measured against some service that is quantified and delivered to the state. That is why they are getting what they are getting. And what I am paid should be measured against some level of productivity or some level of performance measurement. But the problem we face in the country is that in many cases, the way we employ people into the public sector is problematic. Either it's based on politics or it's based on family relations, etc. So as a result of that, it weakens supervision. It weakens monitoring. Measurements of performance in some cycles is not even done without compromising the metrics that have been put in place. So I believe those are the issues that I think he was trying to address.
I get that you're being a bit cautious because, of course, this is another academic also delivering his thoughts and very economic, the analysis, macroeconomy and all of that, and all the different factors. But I'm putting it to you, Professor Gachi. I just want to find out. Looking at all of these dynamics, the economic situation we find ourselves in, I've told you the basis for which 3,000 nurses have left the country. We know about the inflation and all of that. I am asking you at this point in time, when you look at averagely what we earn in the public sector and the cost of living, is it justifiable when people say we need more? In other words, are public sector workers averagely being overpaid? That is, I mean, we can go into the analysis of what Professor Enim says, but I'm asking you, I'm putting the question to you.
Well, I think cost of living drives the demand or extra demand for a pay or some kind of intervention, and that is not bad. And that is what we have been doing. That is the reason why sometimes even the employer, I'm talking about the public sector, sometimes come in with some support they call COLA. So that is recognized. So I don't think when people are calling for extra pay or some sort of a response from government because cost of living has gone up significantly is anything new, and it is not bad, in my opinion. And there is labor mobility. So if you are working as a nurse in Ghana and you think that the conditions within which you are working are not favorable, and it is easy for you to move to US or UK and the rest to work, that does not affect any rule. So you can do that. But that gives a signal to work on our environment, to make the environment more attractive In terms of the wages, we give them the working conditions. In fact, the environment that some people work is very, very difficult to classify as a working environment. The employer ought to invest in making sure that the environment within which people work is conducive and make them give off their best. So all those issues are broad issues that we need to discuss.
Right.
But I do not think that people asking for more is against any economic rule. And I'm not sure people moving from Ghana to work legitimately outside the country is against any rule.
Right.
That gives a signal to improve our environment.
All right, gentlemen, do hold for me. As I bring in Isaac Kofi for a bit of analysis in studio. And Isaac, it is interesting because that also brought to mind when we talk about Article 71 office holders. You know, Togbe Apede and the Council of State. How many times does the council sit in a year? For example, his ex gratia almost 400,000, and he decided to return it to the state. But then you ask yourself, when we talk about equal work for equal pay or output and all of that, it brings to mind so many questions, doesn't it? But let's take a look at the public sector workers' salaries, wages, and what dimensions we can look at this morning.
All right, then. So the last time, the basic salary was actually increased was this year, somewhere around January.
Right.
That was just about 7%. That was the proposed amount. And then if you should look at the trend analysis, the number of times we've had, public sector workers, salaries being increased from 2012 to 2020, you could see a downward trajectory in terms of the percentage change or the rate of change. So somewhere in 2012, just after the public sector joint, standing negotiation committee was initiated, 18% increase in their salary was actually introduced, and this was actually dropped in 2013 to somewhere around 10%, and in 2014 there was no an increment just because the COLA was actually introduced in 2014, and in 2015 that was around 15%, and right from then you could see a downward trajectory. Even after COVID, the proposed percentage change or increase was somewhere around 4%, and this year is around 7%.
So the highest we're looking at is a 2012.
Yeah, that was
18%.
2012.
Which is pretty close to what, interestingly, trade unions have been calling for.
Absolutely.
Around the 19%, the last inflationary rate.
And right after that moment, they've never had such, an increase before. It's been somewhere around 9%. But this year, after COVID, where probably we were expecting that it could go high, or somewhere around 4% and then even 7%, which they have said is woefully inadequate. But we've also been comparing the percentage change in terms of the salary from the Article 71 holders. Let's focus on the president and that of public sector workers. And you could see that, the percentage change is not really different, but we've talked a lot about inequality. So the next slide will show you that although the percentage change is actually almost the same, but when you look at the inequality gap, it's
so the quantum, right?
Huge.
The quantum.
Exactly.
Right.
How much you are taking home or how much you are earning as a basic salary. So if you look at an Article 71 holder, their average salary is somewhere around 18,211 Ghana cedis. And that of a single spine salary structure. This was as of 2016.
Right.
Single spine salary structure, someone on the single spine is earning somewhere around 1,128.
So the disparity in there, something around 16,000.
17,000.
That's the difference. 17,088
Ghana cedis. That's huge.
Wow.
And the highest earner on the Article 71, salary structure, that was the president back in 2016, was earning somewhere around 29,899 Ghana cedis. And the highest person on the single spine then in 2016 was earning somewhere around 4,324 Ghana cedis. And again, huge difference of 25,575 that year. And the least earner, this is quite worrying. It's very worrying if you should compare the least earner. If you look at the Article 71 holders, the least earner is earning somewhere over 11,000. But on the single spine salary, 2016, that was 178 Ghana cedis.
It would be interesting to find out what the minimum wage was in
I think it should be
2016,
around,
because
9 cedis.
178 cedis is I don't even know. Maybe I'm thinking in today's terms, so I don't even know how one would get by with that.
So you were talking about, the impact of, let's say, inflation. So we did some analysis to see what has been the impact of inflation on the average salary of an Article 7, a single spine salary, someone on a single spine. So let's assume this year, inflation is somewhere around 23.6%. And so it means that, holding other things constant, inflation alone has taken away, if you should compare, let's assume that this amount that they were earning in 2016, they're still earning it right now. If you should compare what they were earning in 2016 to what they were earning now, just last year and this year, it means that if you were earning 1,128 Ghana cedis, inflation has eroded 266. And this is the at least situation. 266 Ghana cedis from it. And if you should check the inflation figures from 2016 to 2021, on average, it's somewhere around 10.78%. And the average value that, we lose annually just because of inflation is somewhere around 121 Ghana cedis. And so the average value lost between the period I'm talking about is around 486 Ghana cedis. Now, hold on.
That is staggering.
Exactly.
That is staggering.
So hold on, let's calculate the effects. So let's say between 2016 and 2021, due to inflation, you've lost 605 Ghana cedis. And then from April 2021 to April this year, you've lost 266 Ghana cedis. If you should total this, that's somewhere around 871. And if you should net this, that is the average salary that someone on a single spine salary structure is taking. That's 1,128. If you should net this, it means that in real terms, if you should take away inflation, that's somewhere around 271 Ghana cedis.
Every month.
Every month. To be fair, there have been some increase in terms of the salary, basic salary, but
like you mentioned, 7% this year.
But the change is not enough to actually offset the 871 Ghana.
So that would leave you with a difference of 600 cedis, basically.
Yeah. So it means that your 1,128 Ghana cedis you were earning, inflation has actually reduced it to somewhere around 271 Ghana cedis, and that's the at least situation. But to be fair, government has done their best. They've increased it over the years, and that could offset, but it's not enough to actually take away the impact of inflation on.
All right. So that is the last bit we were looking at. But just to summarize before you take leave of us. So over the years, especially from 2012, where we had our highest in terms of the increment of public sector wages, there's been a constant fall. Within 2021, 2022, it's been the worst we've seen because 4% last year and now 7%. But then you look at inflation, currently at 23.6%. And like you did the analysis, just off the top of my head, someone earning the 1,100 plus cedis or 1,200 averagely would now be getting the value of about 900 cedis per what they are.
Exactly.
So you're taking home about 1,200, but the real value of what you're getting is about 900 cedis.
900 cedis.
And again, the Article 71 office holders, it is clear that even as these shocks are felt generally across the economy, they would feel it much less because of the quantum of money they are getting.
They have, all the allowances. So.
Plus the figure there, even the least one, 11,000 plus.
The highest on the Article 71 holder is earning somewhere around 49,000 now. That's a precedent. And if you should compare it to the figures we just churned out, huge difference for public sector workers.
Kofi, this is very important what you've done. Kudos to you for that fantastic job. Isaac Kofi Ajay, my colleague there, walking us through the facts and the figures. But let me bring back Professor Kobina Enim, Samuel Kobina Enim, as we get ready to wrap up on this conversation. So, interesting dynamics, Prof. Whether we've said it covertly or not, the die has been cast. From the conversations we've had, we definitely have to find ways of, checking, especially public sector workers. Like you have proposed that we ought to have something close to the Public Accounts Committee to ensure that we get value for money. But beyond that, we should also look at giving people what they merit, especially on the back of inflation. What would you propose from where you sit, Professor Enim, moving forward?
Thank you very much once again. So two things. One is I must indicate that the Fair Wages and Salary Commission is very much interested in pushing this conversation on productivity. I've had initial discussions that hopefully we're going to sort of tighten up some of the proposals for measuring productivity within the public sector. So that conversation has started. Permit me to also indicate that the lecture had different dimensions to it. And I think Professor Babwate tried alluding to the issue of unemployment, which I raised. I think it's a conversation we really need to have. We want to tackle unemployment head on. I touched on three other variables which I believe that you can help carry the message in terms of the discourse that it needs. One had to do with trade vulnerabilities. I said that if you look at the value of our import and putting blame on the Russian-Ukraine invasion, and these two countries come about 6th, 7th over the last 2 years, the question that I pose is, what would have happened if we had challenges in the top 5 countries where we rely on, especially for the countries that we rely on for single commodities? So the conversation around trade vulnerability should happen some way. Then the second one has to do with capital flight, which I did indicate that it's difficult tracking it because it has several dimensions. The illegal part, which is the illicit financial flows, is definitely difficult to track. But if you think about the fact that at some point it was about a fifth of our GDP, then in as much as we are discussing inflation, exchange rate, we need to put some weight on the discussion of capital flights. Otherwise, a lot of activities will happen in the country and all the returns will go out there. So we wouldn't get the multiplier effect, i.e. taxes that we need from that. And lastly, I talked about the issues of stocks of grains. I keep saying that the inflation that we are having is not a monetary side issue only. It requires a supply side. So we really need to think about what we have, and it's purely a distributional issue to a very large extent. And demonstrated the extent to it, people take advantage of crisis times, and we see stark variations in prices, not inflation, in prices across our outlets that we collect the monthly information for the computation of CPI and inflation. Thank you very much.
Right before you go, Prof, just to sneak in this one because of what you mentioned. So can we look forward to anything after your engagements with the Fair Wages and Salaries Commission? Can we look forward to any action this year in terms of what you've been discussing with them?
I mean, there is an extent that I can go. My responsibility is to just put out the numbers and give in on areas that they have to look at. But the policymakers would have to determine whether something would happen this year or not. And that is why we have hinted that this is going to happen, and we are hoping that you can follow through to ensure that the policymaker acts.
Professor Enim, we're incredibly, immensely grateful for your time this morning. Thank you so much, sir. And all the best.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right. Let me also bring in Professor Babwate for your concluding comments. So, gentlemen, for the rest of you, I'll be taking your concluding comments on the way forward. Professor Enim has started the conversation, and maybe fittingly so, whether he said overpaid or not is not the matter right now. The point is, how do we harness the best from our public sector workers, and how do we also ensure that they are getting paid what they actually deserve? I'll start with you, Professor Babwate.
Well, thank you very much. I will conclude by hammering on the issue of productivity.
Right.
And in the literature and in practice, productivity and measuring productivity and ensuring that people work is the responsibility of the employer. It's not the responsibility of the worker. If you employ somebody, you have to give him the tools, the equipment to be able to work. You have to ensure that you give him all the supervision. You have to give the person the target and make sure that he achieves it. If he's not able to achieve it, if there are sanctions, the person suffers from it. You made a very good point that Ghanaians seem not to be so much productive, but when we go out there, we are able to work harder. It is because out there in the US, in Germany, elsewhere, supervision is very key. And many of us have tasted working out there. And sometimes it is even difficult, you didn't get time to go and drink water. You are supposed to work for how much you are going to be paid. So going forward, there's nowhere we cannot measure productivity. We can measure productivity and get it closer to the best. But the major thing is that it's the employer's responsibility to ensure that the worker that he is paying, he has given all the necessary tools and equipment and giving the target, and also making sure that he is supervised and deliver. And when he delivers, then it means that how much is going to be paid is something that he can measure and equate it to the productivity or what he has been able to bring on board.
All right. Interesting points there, Professor Boaboateng. We're very grateful that you joined the conversation this morning, and do have the best of the day. Let me go now to Dr. Patrick Asuming, who is with the University of Ghana Business School. Your take, Doc.
Well, I think so I like the data that your colleague Kofi showed. And I mean, what I would say is that, if the average Article 71 office holder, we have a way of measuring that this is what they are bringing to government output, and we are paying them more based on what they are bringing, there's no problem with that. Everybody has to earn their salary. If a private business is paying people more than they are bringing on the table, that business will collapse eventually. So it is not enough. So the cost of living rising is a reason to ask for more salary. But that more salary has to come with we putting more on the table, providing more output, so that when the employer pays that extra output, it is not going out of business. So I think everybody has to earn their salary. Or I think the main point on this part of the discussion from the presentation is that we have to find a way of measuring what everybody is bringing on the table so that we pay them appropriately.
And just a follow-up, quick one, very quickly. A thought just came to mind. On the back of Togbe Apede giving back about 400,000 Ghana cedis to the state by way of ex gratia given him that he feels is inappropriate. Look at an entity like the Council of State, and it's not to demean the work they do, but how often do they sit in a year, the conditionalities and everything, and earning such a whopping sum at the end of a tenure? So is it high time we started looking at the earnings of Article 71 office holders? I know there's a whole dynamic, legally speaking, to it, but should what they earn and their ex gratia and all of that, should it reflect the times, the economy we have, like we're having now? Look at inflation. What do you think, Dr. Asuming? And I'll throw that same question to Professor Gachi as well, but I'll start with you, Dr. Asuming.
Well, I think, for me, I will lean more towards earning being paid what you have earned. And I think if at the time you were working, your salary was commensurate with what you're providing, then you have to question why, when you are leaving, you decide that we will pay you so much as gratia. So there are two things. What you earn, if you look at normal workers, what you earn, your gross, part of it is taken away as net and is invested. And that is what, when you go to retirement, we pay you. So if we're able to demonstrate that this ex gratia that we are paying is actually part of people's contribution, then okay, go ahead with it. But there's also another side that, there's such big pay disparity. I think that's where the, paying based on the times come in. If there's such big pay disparity and the people that we've put in leadership, we say, okay, now we are in difficult times. So some of the perks that we are giving, we are going to give some of them up. I think, in terms of leadership, showing, especially when you're asking people to contribute a little bit more because you're in difficult times, showing that leadership by saying that maybe I may have been entitled to this, but because of the difficult times we are in, I'm also going to sacrifice it. Because mind you, when the discussion about raising pay comes up, one of the points that we hear is that, well, we are in difficult times, the economy cannot sustain. It shouldn't be that one group are being asked to make the sacrifice and others are receiving all the perks that they are receiving.
Right. Dr. Isuming, thank you for joining the conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I'll wrap with Professor Gachi. Over to you, sir. Hello, Prof.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
We all do agree that productivity issues are real. We need to tackle it. And I believe in doing so, it's not only about the measurement of productivity, but how we give orientation to ourselves that those who are supposed to supervise and monitor are effective at it. I believe that is where one of the challenges is coming from. Now, your next issue about ex gratia being retained by Togbi Afede, I think that is a laudable development, but we need to discuss this in context. In context, because I believe whatever Article 71 office holders have received is based on law.
Oh, right. So, Prof, just to clarify, I wasn't denouncing that. I was just saying that should we also be looking at their output as Article 71 office holders, whether maybe, I'm careful, I don't want to use the word merit such gargantuan figures, but whether we can even also trim down Article 71 office holders' earnings and ex gratia in line with where our economy is. That was the point, not to say that probably everyone should be sending their money back. No.
Yeah. Well, I believe I made a point when I had the time earlier that whatever we give to Article 71 office holders should be based on some measurable services that they deliver to the country. If that is done, then we all know that their services are benchmarked to whatever they receive. So that is something we can do. And if we say we are trying to control payment of salaries, wages, allowances during hard times, it will cut across board. So if it affects the presidency, if it affects ministers and their deputies, etc., it should affect all those people who are in government are taken from the consolidated fund. So that would be my thinking. But what Togbi Afede has done is purely voluntary. Those who have received and they have not returned, they are within the law. If there is any reason why we want to rationalize and put them in a different category, we can go ahead to develop that law. But in my opinion, as it is, those who are received, they are received genuine salary. Togbi Afede was not returning because it is illegal, but because he felt, looking at his stature, what he is earning on his own, he can deliver a service to the country in this hard time without taking that money.
And that indeed is the rationale behind what he did. But thank you so much, Prof, as well, for joining the conversation. Professor John Gachi, Dean, UCC School of Business. So we had Professor Kobena named the statistician, government statistician, join the conversation. Dr. Patrick Isuming of the University of Ghana Business School. Professor Bam Boateng, and now Professor John Gachi. But up next, we also have a conversation when it comes to pressure groups and how efficient they have been. As we talk about public sector workers, how about our pressure groups? And the context has to do with fix the country, or maybe should the fix the country group itself be fixed? How have pressure groups fared? We'll be having that conversation next on the AM show. Stay.